Good evening and welcome to Law and Order, brought to you exclusively by Channel I. Sri Lankans love their sports, be it cricket or football. Sports forms an integral part of our day-to-day lives, and our love for cricket needs no mention here. I think any Sri Lankan is aware or remembers what they were doing and where they were when we won the World Cup in 1996. And when we saw that momentous occasion when Benazir Bhutto was handing over the World Cup to the Captain Cool, he was termed at the time, Mr. Arjuna Ranatunga. And then, of course, when it comes to swimming, we've produced some really great champions of the sport. And some of those notable names are people like Julian Bowling. And then, of course, we have in track and field, Damayanti Darsha and Susantika Jayasinghe. But the fact remains that all of these great sportsmen and sportswomen were produced more than 2.5 decades ago. And I think it would be a safe assessment to say that sports in Sri Lanka has seen somewhat of a decline over the past 2.5 decades. So I believe it would be an opportune moment right now to discuss the state of sports in Sri Lanka from a legal perspective. And to help us with that is a very special guest, Mr. Shanaka Amarasinghe, who counts more than 16 years in the legal profession and also as a sports analyst. Welcome, Shanaka, to the show.
Thanks very much, Mokshini. Thank you for having me.
So, you heard what I just said. Do you think it's safe for me to say that sports has seen a decline over the past 25 or so years? Because it was way back in the 90s that we saw all these notable achievements on behalf of Sri Lanka.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that decade, Mokshini, because that's where things really started to shift in global sports. So you talk about 1996, and it was a bunch of amateur cricketers who really got themselves together under one very strong leader and managed to win the World Cup for us. And if you take 3 years hence in 1999, the world had kind of moved on, and Sri Lanka was still pretty much that team of 1996, which did really badly in that 99 edition of the World Cup.
That's right, yes.
So you look at 1996, it's also interesting to note that that was the time in which Super Rugby first started, which is the New Zealand rugby competition, which is a franchise professional rugby competition. And you look at what that has done for the All Blacks in the last decade and a half, and the talent that it produces to that team, and you look at the regression of Sri Lanka cricket and you contrast those two things, the one word that comes to mind is professionalism. So what happened in the 90s is that sport professionalized, and it started with rugby, then with cricket, and a lot of sports in the mid-90s tended to become professionalized. Now, when you define things, as we like to do as lawyers,
yes,
professionalism means that money flows into the sport and you're paid to do a job. So sports became something that was more than a pastime, it became an actual job as well. And as a result of that, people needed to spend more time on it, become better at it, become more scientific about it, and that's what the rest of the world did. Unfortunately, I don't think Sri Lanka really kept up to the rest of the world. And professionalism is not something that we find across the board in Sri Lanka, Mokshini, and that's probably the root cause, I would think, of what you just described as what is a decline in Sri Lankan sports over the last decade and maybe 2 decades.
So you mentioned that soon we went from amateurs to professionals. The key difference was that money started flowing in, and that is what caused the regression of sports. How can you link it to the flow of money in that sense?
Okay, so let's start with the flow of money. When money flows into everything, Mokshini, whether it's any sort of public money, there needs to be regulation, which is why we have the Auditor General, which is why every company needs to provide audited accounts and that kind of thing. There is an understanding around the world that when money is used, it needs to be used well. And that is why the whole audit practice exists, just to see that people are not pocketing that money and running off with it themselves, which is why the entire practice exists. So when you pump money into something, you need to make sure that returns on investment are happening. And the issue with Sri Lanka is, although we opened ourselves up to broadcast rights, which brought a lot of money in to Sri Lanka cricket at the time, and things like that, we haven't really kept up in terms of professionalism on the field. And there's not enough regulation to make sure that that happens. So while you can audit a set of accounts with auditors coming over, the Auditor General sending his team over, and you can pour over books, you don't really have enough of a system in place to look at whether that is actually happening on the field. Have our athletes been given enough nutrition? Have they been given enough rest? Do they have enough facilities to train in? Are their selections being done in a scientific manner? So that kind of financial audit that happens also needs to spill over onto the field. And I think I'm probably right when I say that that level of professionalism has not spilled over into the actual nitty-gritty side of the sports. So that is why we find ourselves lagging behind on a global scale. If you'd permit me, and if I have the time to tell you this example now,
please go ahead.
We looked at the Sri Lanka under-19 team, the Junior National Rugby Asia in 2001. We produced an outstanding team led by another legal colleague of ours, Jeevan Gunatilaka. Right. And he took that team to Chile for the World Cup of Rugby in juniors, and that's the highest pinnacle we've ever been to in junior rugby. You look at another sporting team about that time, the junior sports team of 2000, the cricket team. They played a final here against India and they lost. But they managed to make it to the final, and that was a team that boasted the likes of Kaushal Lokuarachi, Tiruna Kandambi, Akalanka Ganegama, Jehan Mubarak. There were several national cricketers that played in that team.
That's in 2000.
In 2000. Mohammad Kaif played for India. Yuvraj Singh played for India. I think Harbhajan Singh may have been in that squad as well.
Some big names.
Some big names. But you look at the Sri Lankan team, not a lot of them had very long careers. The guys who came in from the junior, very talented junior national side. Whereas you look at Yuvraj Singh, he was one of the few guys to make it to the squad, but he had an immensely long career because there is a professionalism attached at every level, so that when you graduate through the ranks, you kind of tend to be able to separate the cream from the rest of it. So like the junior national team which went to Chile, they played against the likes of Carlos Spencer, Joe Rokotoko, huge names in world rugby. They were playing pretty much on the same pitch. They saw these guys in the same stadia. So they came back with a wealth of experience, with so much team spirit. And unfortunately, we weren't able to keep those teams together, Mokshini. And that is the issue with regard to making sure that you allow teams to graduate and you have a professional structure in place which will keep these guys in the game. Many people give up if they don't make it to the national ranks because there's not enough money in the game below the national level. So we allowed these teams to just dissipate, and those were two very talented teams at the turn of the century, which we could have maybe taken up to World Cup level, or at least in rugby at Asian level, we could have hung on to those guys, but didn't happen.
That really is quite a pity. I mean, this is news to me. I had no idea that we actually sent a team of our cream rugby players to Chile. Just relating that back to what you mentioned earlier about the fact that every company is required to conduct an audit to ensure that the money that flows into that company or organization is used in an efficient manner to ensure that it benefits the organization, right? So just relating that to your comments about how these two teams, we don't see them anymore, or rather we didn't see them, you know, rising up to the level of Yuvraj Singh, like you mentioned, from the Indian team. Is that because the money because I believe there was no dearth of money after the 1996 World Cup. So could it be said that the money that was flowing in, since it was not audited efficiently, was not utilized to help these talented sportsmen to hone their talents and to improve? Could it be said that that is the reason why we have seen a decline in sports over the years?
Yes, I would say so. I think it's a result of, again, the accountability and the professionalism not coming into the disbursement of that money.
Right.
So last year, which is the last budget that we have to talk about, we don't really have a budget for 2019 to compare it to, but the 7 billion rupees that was allocated by the Parliament for the Sports Ministry, that's not a small fund, Mokshini. That's a fairly hefty...
Quite sizable, yes.
Exactly. So it's not like we can say we don't have the funding. And that 7 billion can be siphoned off into maybe sports that are less profitable than maybe cricket or rugby or something like that, which have sponsors in them. So we've got 63 sports spread across the country and under the purview of the ministry. So they've got to really spread that 7 billion across those 63 sports. So even if you do the math on that, that's still more than 100 million a sport if you really want to think about it.
Yes.
So the issue is, what is happening to that money? Do we know what's happening to that money? Is there any accountability? I noticed a program from last week where you talked to Sankita about the right to information.
That's right, yes.
So we can perhaps ask, maybe national sports associations would say, how have you dispersed this money? We've got only a measly allocation for this. Can you tell us how the other monies have been dispersed? So in addition to professionalism, there is also the accountability factor, Mokshini, which we've got. So if you've got money, if you've got professionalism and you've got accountability, you've got a good system. So we seem to have the money, and the money keeps flowing in from broadcast rights and things like that. But professionalism and accountability are things that could really improve for us to take our teams forward.
So speaking on professionalism, would you say that sportsmen themselves who are retired professional sportsmen should also be involved in the management of the sport? That will lead me to my next question, which is, how are these sports managed? Is there some regulatory body that ensures that these 63 sports are accountable in some way to the Minister of Sports? How does that hierarchy work? That's the other limb of my question. And thereafter, if you could just enlighten us on whether you think that, you know, these bodies which govern these 63 sports should comprise of retired sportsmen who are professionals, or whether we should look at people who are just simply good at managing.
Well, I'll deal with the second part of your question first, Mokshini. And if you look at sports people who have excelled, it's largely because they've dedicated their lives to a sport. And that requires you to practice, it requires you to spend a lot of time on the ground or the court or the pool or wherever it is you do your sport. And as a result of that, it's not often, and we've heard so many stories about sportsmen just coming to office, marking the register and going away for practice. So as a result of their excellence, they are not exposed to the best management practices. And I don't think you can expect that either. I don't think you can expect someone to be a really successful CEO of a company while also playing for a national team at a pretty high international level. I don't think that's fair to expect. And while we did have a tradition of ex-national players in whatever sport being the ones who then moved on to administrate that sport, we need to realize that that was an archaic practice. It was fine when the sports law of 1973 was in action because everything was amateur. You had people turning up and leaving office early to come and coach their teams. But that's not how it works now. We have full-time dedicated professional coaches, which leads me to think that we need to have full-time dedicated professional administrators as well. If you look at successful cricket and maybe rugby or anything else, you look at Cricket Australia, you look at the New Zealand Rugby Football Union, all governed not by ex-All Blacks or ex-Wallaby players. They're governed by guys who are at the top of their game. They pay big money to big CEOs to lure them in from companies, private companies, and say, run this operation like a business.
Right.
And so I think that step needs to happen. So the law needs to move from 73 to 2019, where we are now. And I think the personnel also need to upscale their skills from 1973 to 2019, where we are now. So that brings us actually to the first part of your question, where you asked what the hierarchy is. And the hierarchy goes something like this, Mokshini. So if you want to play a sport, you just need to start playing it. Right? And after you start playing that sport, then you develop that sport a little bit across the country, in your back garden, whatever it might be. And then you register with the Ministry of Sports as the national association for that sport.
Right.
So the Athletics Association of Sri Lanka is the national association for athletics. So you can't have another association purporting to be the National Association for Track and Field.
Right.
Similarly, Sri Lanka Cricket is the National Association for Cricket in Sri Lanka. So you can't have another association springing up and saying, hey, our team can beat yours, so let us be the national team. You have to go through that process. So there has been a lot of debate as to whether that process is an efficient one, but it seems to be the only one available to us at the moment. So with regards to whether the law needs to be amended on that fact, I think the jury is out. I think we may need to consider amendments. How we are going to amend it, of course, is something that needs to be discussed in pretty minute detail. So once you have that National Association for Sports, you have them reporting to the sports minister. So every time a team leaves Sri Lanka's shores, it could be any team, the minister has to sign off on it. And that's the official rubber stamp that says that this is a recognized Sri Lankan team. You can wear the flag of Sri Lanka. We are sending you forward as our ambassadors. So for that process to happen, the ministry involvement or some state involvement is somewhat necessary. But apart from that, usually the national associations are a collection of members. So it's a very democratic kind of function that they serve. They have member clubs or member bodies that get together, vote in a president and vote in a committee, chairman or whoever it may be, and they manage the affairs of that National Sports Association. While the ministry does have some purview, while the national associations need to get their accounts audited by the Auditor General every year, I'm not sure that these happen with as much rigor as they're supposed to happen. So you have this kind of democratic, laissez-faire sports associations, which then come under the parachute supervision of the ministry as well. So there is a little bit of dissonance there. So that is something that we have to make sure we fix if the sports law is, and I think it has, to be amended.
So does the sports law, you said that it is in dire need of review, but does the existing sports law, which came into effect in 1973, does it provide for the regulation of these smaller clubs as well?
Well, it doesn't provide for the regulation per se.
Right.
So we were talking earlier about should it be retired sports people that run these bodies? Well, some constitutions of sports bodies can have requirements saying if you are to become president of this club, you have to have played this particular sport at X level or Y level. So you have to play it at least a domestic level or at an international level. So if you want to take that mandate away from those associations, that may be viewed as undemocratic.
Right.
So there is a little bit of a problem there. So until the sports associations themselves realize the value of professionalism and the value of the sport being taken to the next level by those professionals, then we are going to have a little bit of a problem in imposing that structure. But what the ministry can do is make sure that it's governed properly in terms of making sure good governance is taking place, but that would require a bit of an autocratic influence, because we've had situations in the past where interim committees have been appointed. We had that with badminton, we had it with basketball, we had it with, we have innumerable issues with SLASU also recently.
That's true. That word interim has become somewhat of a bad word or dirty word in sports these days.
Exactly.
Isn't it?
So what happens there is you have two warring factions within the sports association, and one of them runs after the minister, the other one runs after the minister, and then the minister, because he can't really adjudicate, he says, okay, here's an interim committee, let's run the sport. And the interim committee don't have the in-depth knowledge of the sport, they don't have a lot of expertise in order to be able to do the job that needs to be done. So what we have on one hand is a lack of expertise on the ground, and on the other hand, we have a lack of a mechanism for good governance of these sports. So I don't think the ministry can impose itself too much. If it does, it could create really bad publicity, because we had a situation previously also where, for example, in Sri Lanka cricket, where the minister appointed an interim committee, and then the ICC, which is the world governing body of the sport, of which Sri Lanka cricket is a member, said, sorry, we don't recognize these politically appointed members. So there is that tension to manage as well. So it's a very difficult balance to find, Mokshini, and I think we need to start from the place of the sports associations, the sports people, the parents, the coaches, everyone who's involved being on the same page and wanting to take the step forward. And I don't think we have that culture in our sports at the moment.
That is actually quite sad to hear, but you mentioned constitutions, right? Now, these small-scale clubs which are formed, say at village level or whatever, they have a constitution that governs the way they administer their particular club. So do these constitutions have to fall within the ambit of a certain format that the ministry or the sports law has prescribed, or are they given a great deal of autonomy to decide on what should be in that constitution?
Well, the clubs themselves are largely self-regulated entities, but the clubs come together to make the National Association. And when the clubs come together to make the National Association, the Sports Ministry has helpfully given us the regulations of 2016, which say that you have to have a treasurer who is a qualified accountant, that if you are a member of certain trades, or if you have a particular conflict of interest, if you are a coach, then you can't be a member of the executive committee of that National Association. So there are guidelines which have been set out by the regulations of 2016, but once again, I'm not sure whether we have the rigorousness of them being applied in detail. So that's something the new minister can probably look at. The National Sports Council, which has just been appointed, perhaps they can look at implementing those regulations of 2016 and auditing across the national associations whether that has in fact taken place.
Tell me something about the National Sports Council that you just mentioned. What is its role?
Well, they're the apex body under the minister. He is appointed by the minister, 15 members strong, and the new chairman of the National Sports Council is General Daya Ratnayaka, who was also the president of the Athletics Association. So they've got a very good team, judging by the names that I saw listed out. And what they have to do is they've got to implement policy, and not only discuss policy and set policy down on a piece of paper, they've also got to implement it. This is an ongoing feud I've had with Mahela Jayawardena while he was captain and when I was into broadcast journalism. He used to say, yes, we've talked about our issues and we hope that they'll be ironed out. And I used to always ask him, yes, Mahela, but you've talked about it, but what have you actually done about it? And that sometimes that execution at the practice level is something that I think we sometimes lack. We love to talk like we are doing right now.
That's right.
But what else are we doing on the field practically?
So by way of summary, Shanaka, could you just enlighten us? Could you just enlighten us on what ails sports in Sri Lanka right now? If you could just, by way of summary. I know it's somewhat of a challenge to summarize it, but if you could, in a nutshell, just set it out for our viewers.
Well, I could write a book about it, Mokshini, but I won't. But I would say that the lack of accountability and the lack of expertise in the decision makers is a problem. The accountability for the disbursement of funds efficiently is a problem. Who decides what is efficiently is a matter of skill. It's a matter of management. And we don't have enough of those people in our sports administration to make sure that happens. So if you look at players that have kind of made it, like Shehan Abepitiya, who won a 2008 Commonwealth Youth Gold Medal, where is he now? Why has he not been looked after? And those are things that we need to ask ourselves, that innumerable anecdotes, but I would say professionalism and accountability are the biggest problems, the biggest two hurdles that our athletes face.
Thank you, Shanaka. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Professionalism and accountability, the two main factors which our guest tonight says is what ails sports in Sri Lanka right now. That's all we have time for, but let me just take this opportunity to thank you, Shanaka, for taking time off your busy schedule as a practicing lawyer and also a sports analyst and broadcaster to join us in the studios of Channeleye to enlighten our viewers on Sri Lankan sports.
It's been a pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, do not fear. Shanaka will be joining us next week as well, and we will be delving deeper into the sports law, and we will look forward to picking his brain on why our Sri Lankan athletes and sportsmen just do not come up to the same standard as their international counterparts. Thank you for joining us once again on another episode of Law and Order. We look forward to having you next week as well. Good night.